I would like I would like to introduce Alexandra Morton. She has written some of my favorite books, Listening to the Whales, What the Orcas Have Taught Us, In the Company of Whales, just some wonderful work that she has done with the northern resident killer whales, and then her activism to save British Columbia's wild salmon. And I'm very excited to have her here and look forward to her presentation. So, Alexandra, go ahead and take it away. And you can introduce yourself a little bit further.
Thank you so much, Joy. Yeah, my name's Alexandra Morton. I'm originally from Connecticut, but I left as soon as I could drive and came to Los Angeles, where I began a study in 1979 on the communication between two orca that were in captivity there at marine land of the Pacific. It, of course, was an extraordinary experience. And as a girl, I thought the whales were fine in the tanks. But of course, the more I watched them and the more I began to understand them, and the experience of watching the female give birth to the first orca conceived in captivity, and then watching the calf die and watching this happen repeatedly, made me realize that whales in captivity was wrong. And this was a very unpopular idea at the time. And I suppose it still is in some groups, but among the scientific community, it was really frowned on to view whales as intelligent beings. I mean, the idea that flies now that these groups of different orca and sperm whales and other species have culture, that was just not on the table. And so I struggled as a young woman because I really, my intent was to figure out what they were saying. And I kept thinking, this is a creature that holds its breath, and yet it has this enormous brain, which needs a lot of oxygen, along with a lot of muscle that needs oxygen. And so, I felt that if it wasn't using this brain, that nature would have given it a smaller brain and devoted more of the oxygen in its lungs for each dive, would have devoted more to the muscles. And so really I wanted to know what they were thinking. And of course, these were really lofty ideals for someone who is in her early 20s, but that's what I wanted to do. And so I figured out maybe I thought the best way to go at this would be to record the sounds and the behaviors of the whales simultaneously on a tape recorder. So one track was the whales and one track was me speaking. And I spent a lot of time watching these two whales, Orky and Corky. I was given access to a little booth above the tank where the public couldn't see me or interact with me. And I had a hydrophone down in the tank. And I would spend from 6 o'clock in the evening till 6 in the morning one week. And then the next week, I would do it from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening. And this was my weekends. I wasn't paid to do this. This was just my interest. I guess you could call me a volunteer, but really I was volunteering for my own efforts and interest. And oh my gosh. So here I am, a young woman trying to be like super scientific and don't want to cross any lines. I don't want to be seen as a whale hugger. And in the mornings, these two orca did things that I was just like, oh my gosh, how am I possibly going to report this and have anybody view me as an objective scientist? What they would do is, particularly the female, would go to this one spot. So the tank in those days, well, this park doesn't exist anymore, but it was an amphitheater that was built up, and then there was bleachers that came up off the tank. And so this blocked the sunrise, and the sunrise had to rise to a certain point to actually get and hit the tank. Well, Corky, the female, would go to one spot of the wall of the tank and she would just squirt a little bit of water at it, and then she'd keep circling, and the male would come by and squirt a little bit of water on it, on just one spot. And that spot was invariably where the sunlight first hit the wall of the tank. And once that happened, once that piece of tank wall illuminated with the sun, the whales erupted into, extremely vigorous play. And they would go up and they would lick that spot and spray it and then roar around the tank and create huge waves. And it was a ritual. It was really hard to classify it as anything else. It wasn't for food, it didn't, I don't think it felt good in particular, but it was something they wanted to do. And there was one night when I was watching, when there was quite a big electrical storm, thunderstorm, and the male Orky floated vertically with his head out of the water and his mouth open towards the lightning, where the lightning was striking. And he just was making this long, continuous sort of groaning noise. It was really eerie. And years later, when I was working with whales in Johnson Straits with the northern residents, I also saw that. I didn't really catch up to them at sunrise very often, but I often was with them at sunset. And they were very, very excited by beautiful sunsets. That's when my husband would get the best video, just as the light was he's losing light, the whales became incredibly active. And we saw things like multiple spy hops where the whales were all lined up together and going down with their bellies towards this beautiful sunset. And so really early on in working with orcas, I had to figure out how to handle this kind of information, which just kept coming. There was one incident where I had spent a summer in Johnson Straits in British Columbia. I actually tracked down the family of the female. She was from the A5 Northern Resident Pods. We knew who her mother was, A23 or Stripe. And we knew this because Dr. Michael Bigg of the government here had collected all the photographs people took during the capture operations. And of course, Corky was terrified, and she stuck close to this one female who got released. And when Dr. Michael Bigg found the mother and the rest of the family, he thought, well, that must have been the family that Corky was taken from. And indeed, Corky spoke that A5 dialect perfectly. She hadn't lost any of that. She was caught in 1969, and I caught up with her in 1979. And she'd just been a 5-year-old, but she still knew her language very, very well. And so when I came back the first summer after being with the wild whales, I was talking to the trainer, one of the trainers, and I said, I'd love to see how you get across to the whales what you want them to do. Like, how do you introduce a new behavior concept to them? And trainer's like, yeah, sure, I can do that. But we've kind of run out of things to train them to do. They wave their tails, they wave their pectoral fins, they jump, they do this, they do that. And I said to her, well, in Johnson Straits, I saw a behavior there that I've never seen these guys do. And that is when they rise to the surface and they're in the peak of their surfacing, sometimes they would roll and slap their dorsal fins on the water. So not their fins or their tails, but their dorsal fins. Of course, I'm imagining this as I'm telling this woman. And she's like, yeah, sure, we'll do that at some point. And she picks up her buckets and she walks away, and Corky rises to the surface and slaps her dorsal fin on the surface. And then she does it again, and she does it again. And I race down, catch up to the trainer. I was like, oh my God, you got to see this. We run back up. Well, by now, Corky has produced this enormous wave in the tank, and she's rising up to the top of that wave. And when she gets to the top, she's rolling over and slapping her dorsal fin. I had watched these whales for hundreds of hours, I had never seen that behavior. And the trainer looks at me and she goes, yeah, well, that's orca for you. Or I think she used the word killer whales. Um, Everybody knew that they appeared to be able to what, read your mind at times. I don't know. And so what I decided to do after much thought and consternation and concern about how to um, deal with these things, I decided to just form like a part of my memory that I would hold these things intact, not forget them, but also don't try to explain them. Just keep watching for them. And so this was part of the evolution of studying whales for me. And so the second year I went to Johnson Straits was 1980, and I loved everything about British Columbia. I loved how wet it was. I loved the whales. I loved the giant toads. I just loved everything, and I realized I wanted to live there. But as an American, that wasn't going to be possible. So I set my goals on Southeast Alaska. But that year, I met a very cute Canadian filmmaker, and within a year, or within 6 months, we were married and living on a boat, and looking for a place to study whales year round. I really, I really loved the work of Dr. Jane Goodall, where she put herself in the environment of the animals and met with them on their terms, and then also got to see, who they really were. Obviously, as you guys, I'm sure, are all aware, there's not a lot you can learn about whales in captivity other than the stress and distress of being in captivity for these creatures. I feel, I do feel guilty to this day that I didn't do more to get those whales out of captivity, but I was absolutely determined not to be an environmentalist, not to get sidetracked, because as a girl, I had read every single book on people that had gone into the wilderness to study, elephants, primates, hyenas, a myriad of species. And every single book was the same. Part one was fabulous. It was like, oh, wow, everything, the adventure, the discovery, what they were learning. And part two was invariably, oh no, something humans are doing is destroying all of this. And part three was these poor people who had gone into the wilderness, who now have to try to talk to government and corporations and communities. Uh, and so I wasn't going to do part two and part three. I was just going to stick to part one. But what I didn't realize is the environment that was being changed that affected the whales was also the environment I was living in. It was my world too. And so there's nowhere to go to escape this anymore. And again, Jane Goodall, who, she really opened the door to me, because prior to her appearing on the cover of National Geographic, there was no role model, particularly for a young woman, of going into the wilderness and studying animals. I honestly thought interest in animals was child's play, that I was going to have to grow up and give this interest up and do something legitimate, like maybe study the stars or something. And I tried to get interested in astronomy for a while, but I just couldn't. And then she appeared on the cover of National Geographic. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, well, this is possible. That's what I'm going to do. And then later in her career, she made it very clear that activism was the responsibility of scientists who have gone into a place and now have the numbers, and so can translate impacts from the observed world to the world that our governments are supposed to be occupying. They don't always, obviously, but you're supposed to be able to go to government and say, we can see that the decay of the ecosystem is happening, and here is the evidence, and here are the measurements, and here's the trend. And we believe that this activity needs to end. Otherwise, you're going to end up here with, extinctions. Um, but when that doesn't work, what do you do? And so Jane Goodall, I don't know if any of you have heard her talk, but she's this very demure English sounding woman. And um, she said, I went into this conference as a young woman and I heard about what they were doing to the primates in captivity and the experiments. And she's like, I walked out an activist. I became an activist. So she really legitimized that. However, I still resisted it because I was selfish, because I just wanted to figure out what whales were saying. And so my husband Robin and I found this little community of Echo Bay. We were following Corky's family, and they went into the archipelago, and it looked like this huge, vast wilderness to me. I was so worried about getting lost that I'd keep my finger on the paper chart, because I thought, well, if I lift my finger, I can't really tell where the channels are, and it just looked too confusing. And because we lived in a boat, it was very easy to move into this community, which was a floating community. There was no power, no roads, no ferry. There was a little school, and there was a post office, and it was an archipelago environment. I mean, unlike you guys with the coast of Oregon, which looks very frightening to me, these waters were much calmer and protected. And by now I had a little son, and so we moved in. And for the first few years, it was just the most incredible learning experience. I was in part one of my book, My Life, where virtually every time I went out with the whales, I learned something new. Although, to be honest, I went home with more questions, like why were they doing that, and why did they turn there, and why were they using that vocalization there, and so it's just these endless questions. But what I learned was that in the winter, the resident orca break down into their smallest divisible unit, which is basically mom and the kids, sometimes two sisters and their kids together if they were a small enough group. And they hunted in the kelp beds. They were looking for the overwintering Chinook salmon or smaller rockfish. And I became really interested in this one call because a lot of their sounds were pretty easy to kind of group. These sounds happen during play. These sounds happen during severe stress, which the severest stress I saw was when Corky's babies were removed from her, it was just absolutely heart-rending to see. Some sounds were just super excited. But there was this one sound, and it goes like this. It goes like that. Well, this sound occurred at the beginning of conversations. There'd be like a back and forth. It happened at the end of conversations. It happened when they were turning around. It happened when they got to intersections, like where there's a bunch of different channels. It happened during a birth. And also it happened after Corky's babies were taken away from her. She would just drop to the bottom of the tank and produce this other call over and over and over for 6 hours. She'd just go to the surface, grab a breath of air, go down, lie on the bottom, and just make this one call. But Orky, the male, every now and then he'd go, she wouldn't answer him until finally she would. And the process, took usually a couple of days. And it was always at night that she would answer him. And then the two of them would swim together in parallel, like side by side, breathing at exactly the same second, doing this call back and forth. And the next day, she would begin to eat again. And for all appearances, she would appear somewhat normal. And so I just thought, okay, what connects all these different things together? Whales turning around at an intersection, whales grieving, Anyway, my working hypothesis was that it was a moment of synchrony among the whales when all whales were concentrating on one thing. And so And I also noticed that when whales were coming at you, you could hear the "Bah, grr." But when whales were going away from you, basically all you heard was the "er." So it kind of functioned like a bird wing. When, birds really flock together, they'd usually have striping so that the other bird can see when they lift the wing instantly, they know to turn. Well, it had a directionality to it like that. And so, I was just getting on to things like this when the salmon farming industry arrived. And I thought, oh, good idea. Maybe we'll get, some more families. They'll keep our school open. A one-room school is always threatened with closure. There was 20 kids when I started. We got down to eventually like 5. And so families were important to us. And at first, people did come. We became friends. But then the fishermen started to talk to me. Now, I saw fishermen at that time as teachers because I was studying a salmon predator that couldn't speak to me. And fishermen were also a salmon predator, which more or less could speak to me. And so, for example, uh, in the spring, when there's lots of glacier melt in Kinkom and Knights Inlet, the male orcas would swim along with about 6 inches of their dorsal fin showing continuously. They looked like little sharks. It was the only time and place they did that. And I was at a complete loss as to what they possibly could be doing. And so I went to the fishermen and they're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. The glacier meltwater is a 6-foot layer. And these orca are going along with their eyes right below that glacier layer, hunting these big spring salmon or Chinook or kings. And I was like, oh, once they told me, it became so obvious, right? And so anyway, when the farms came in, the fishermen started to talk to me. And they said, hey, look, you have a good relationship with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Could you write a letter to them and say, they're putting these farms in all the wrong places, like where the salmon school, the rock cod are, and the prawns. They were mostly concerned about those 3 species. And so this was, what was this, 1988. And I was like, okay. And I thought this was just like one letter I was going to write. And so I wrote the letter and I got back a letter from DFO, Fisheries and Oceans Canada's acronym is DFO, strangely. And they said, dear Ms. Morton, there's no evidence. I was like, okay, well, I better reword this letter. And so for the next 10 years, I just kept rewording the letters. Well, now we're seeing toxic algae blooms for the first time ever. Well, now we're seeing Atlantic salmon in the rivers. Now we have an outbreak of a bacterial disease in our salmon hatchery that we have never experienced before. And, we've lost a quarter of our brood stock, which we've, average mortality at our hatchery previously was 3%. And the fish farmers are telling us that they have the same disease on their farms before we saw it in the hatchery. And Fisheries and Oceans Canada kept answering, dear Ms. Morton, there's no evidence. Well, then they put acoustic harassment devices on the farms. And these were 198 decibel sound production. That's as loud as a jet engine at takeoff, right at the engine. You and I would not be able to stand that. And I first ran into these, or I first really noticed them when I was watching a group of resident orcas come out of Tribune Channel and go past a farm called the Birdwood Farm. And they were cruising along at a 45-degree angle with their heads out of the water. And I was like, I figured they were looking at something because their eyes were out of the water. And so I was trying to figure out what was so interesting that they all were swimming along in this really weird position. And so I threw my hydrophone over and boy, there was a noise that just slammed the needles of my tape recorder into the red zone and beyond. And I thought it was like a technical malfunction. And so I turned the recorder off and realized actually I could hear the noise through the hull of my boat. And it sounded like big crickets, sort of like that. To me, it didn't sound that loud because it was high frequency, but to the orca, It was pain. Well, that was 1995. And those whales did not come back again, and neither did their families. The mammal eating whales, the transients, or now we call them the Biggs whales, they figured out a new way to go into the archipelago, and they came through different channels. And the reason this was so obvious is because my float house was in one of those channels, and I'd never seen them in Kramer Pass before, and suddenly they were common there. And what they had done is they'd rerouted, so there was always a landmass between them and the farms. But the fish-eating whales, they were not interested in doing that because they wanted to be on the fish migration routes. And all these salmon farms were, of course, on the fish migration routes because those were the places that were good for fish with the upwellings and the oxygenation and the water temperature that the farms needed. So this is where I turned from, writing pathetic letters to thinking, okay, they keep telling me there's no evidence, but they're not out here. So they're just not getting the evidence. So I'm a scientist. So why don't I just start writing papers about the impact of this industry? And I started with the orca. And it's really one of the first papers, and maybe the only one at this point, where it was shown that sound production can displace orca. They can take a lot. They still go into, the city of Vancouver. They go visit Burrard Inlet about once a year, just to kind of look at things, I think, to see where things are at. To a large degree, they tolerated the whale watching industry. They tolerated being shot at, but they could not tolerate these sounds, and they just left. And because we can identify all the whales, of course, by their dorsal fin and their saddle patches, people like Orca Lab, Paul Spong and Helena Simmons, they knew where these whales were. They knew for sure they were still alive. So we teamed up and wrote this paper. But the Canadian government did nothing about it, even though it is against the law to even make a whale deviate from its path. These whales have been displaced from a huge overwintering, territory, and nothing was done. So, the next like 20 years, I had to just start dropping the whale research. First of all, they weren't coming into the place that I had picked to study them, that I knew they existed in. I had a lot of self-doubt. I was like, well, how could I possibly be a whale researcher? If I was really a whale researcher, I would leave. But now I have a kid in the school. My husband had tragically drowned, but I was living there on my own. And this was my home. And I think that people have always fought for their homes. And in the end, I believe that's part of what really motivated me to get so relentlessly involved in trying to get rid of this industry. Or at the beginning, it was just to try to control it, but that failed. And then it became an effort to try to get rid of it. So I ended up opening my home, turning it into a research station, which is what I really wanted to avoid. I read about other researchers doing this. I did not want to deal with grad students, but they were fabulous. And so I opened my home, and in the beginning, I was just feeding them and housing them, and we were all out there studying sea lice. These sea lice, this parasitic crustacean that is natural, but it just grows out of control in the farms, and it kills off wild salmon everywhere that farms and wild salmon exist across the northern hemisphere. We shouldn't have had to do that. I mean, it should have been, DFO should have seen that coming. And published in like the journal Science. I mean, I've published over 20 scientific papers on it. Then the virus issues I became aware of those, and I became a virus hunter. I'm not a virologist, but I was able to find some fabulous virologists to work with, and I became the field end. And I really love going out and finding anything. I can, track anything down that is possible to track down. And so we showed that there was a virus from Norway here, and it was spreading among the wild fish, and the wild fish that were infected were not making it up the Fraser River. Had no effect whatsoever. I took the industry to court 4 times and never lost. but it didn't change anything. The farms just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then in 2017, uh, Paul Watson with Sea Shepherd posted on Facebook that he was sending a boat to help me. And I was like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I wasn't ready to cross that line. And I messaged him back, please take that post down, because I was struggling to be believed by government. I wanted them to believe my science, basically, and not their own science or the industry science, which is it's a, it's a whole nother subject, the corruption of science. But uh, Paul didn't take it down, and I thought about it. And after a few weeks, I was like, okay, why not? I've tried everything. I walked all of Vancouver Island. Went to the AGMs of these companies in Norway. I paddled the lower Fraser River with 100 people, and we took over the streets of Vancouver and walked into a commission into the decline of the Fraser River sockeye, and like nothing worked. And so, as I write about in my book, Not on My Watch, the most amazing thing happened on that boat. Somehow, I truly don't understand it, because all the pieces were here, but in the end, the boat left. But myself and the First Nations of the Broughton Archipelago spent 280 days occupying these salmon farms in the middle of winter. We built houses on the farms. There were solar panels. There was a blow up inflatable unicorn for the young women to just kind of relax in on the summer days. And this brought industry to the table. The First Nation leadership of these young Indigenous people that were on the farms stepped in, and the farms are now being removed. And I'm studying for the first time what happens when you take these farms out. Fish that year after year after year for 2 decades were being eaten to death by sea lice, which is really, the way I study sea lice, I figured out how to do it without killing the fish. Is you take a 150-foot beach seine, you seine the fish in, then you take a bucket of them and you put it in your boat, and you take each one into a little Ziploc baggie, and I could measure it, and then I could put a hand lens on it and count the lice, and then put it into a recovery bucket. And I held fish for a month after doing this to them in a big net pen just to see how they were, and they seemed to be fine. And so that meant I was going eyeball to eyeball with hundreds of fish every single year, and watching these lice crawl all over them and eat them. And, the fish are shivering, and at some point I couldn't stand it anymore. And I would put water in the baggie and then put some tweezers in and start pulling the lice off. And those little fish, the first time the tweezer touched them, they would just freak out. But once I got one louse off of them, they would sit there completely still while I cleaned them off. I know it didn't do any good, because they would just go to the next farm and get infected, but I just felt like I had to do something. And so now this spring, there's areas of the coast where the farms have been removed, and there's areas of the coast where the farms are still there. And the difference is night and day. The fish look beautiful. They're fat and plump, and their eyes are clear, and they're vigorous, and they're so beautiful and adorable, really. And then where there's sea lice, where there's fish farms, they're being eaten to death. And so I was listening to you guys before I began talking, and I was so interested to hear what you're facing. You're looking at, lack of upwelling, starving whales, maybe too much whale watch activity around the whales. And so the questions you're grappling with, I know, is what do you do about that? And I just want to, add a couple of things. And one is, even though I've watched the decline and extinction of some salmon runs, and they are now so close to extinction on this coast that it's uncertain whether they can make a comeback, even though the farms are being removed. Of course, climate change is kicking in, and so these fish are facing so much. But 3 species have returned to this coast since I've been here. The first was the humpback whales. We didn't have any humpback whales when I got here. They had been here, but they got whaled out. And the first ones appeared in 1984. And now there's so many whales, and they're bringing their kids back. And I live on a bluff where there's humpback whales out in front of my house all the time from like the end of May till the beginning of November. The other ones that came back were the Pacific white-sided dolphins, which, boy, those guys are really a rough group. Nobody likes them but us. They mob the whales. They chase the fish. The orcas can't stand them. The humpbacks end up lunging at them and trumpeting because they buzz around their faces. They're merry thugs. They just want to do stuff. And they first showed up in, I think it was like around 1990. Didn't know what they were because I heard them on the hydrophone. And for a few years, there'd just be like 2 or 3 sightings every winter. And then suddenly there was like hundreds, and then there was thousands, like up to 1,000. And then they started to bring the pregnant females started to come in, and we began to see births. Now they've kind of leveled off a little, but everybody thought they were an invasion because they're supposed to be a pelagic species. And so what were they doing in this inlet environment? But I noticed where my kids went to school, the bank there was what looked like dolphin vertebrae and dolphin ear bones in that bank. And so I sent them to an archaeologist that was studying that site. And she had written a paper saying that harbor porpoise were a big part of the First Nation diet in that location. But when she looked at my samples, she's like, you know what? These are actually Pacific white-sided dolphins. So they'd not only been here before, but they were a significant part of the diet of some of the nations that were here. And the dolphins have since sort of peaked and gone down. And the third species are these sea otters. So sea otters were also, killed off, and they there was like 1 or 2 that would hang around, and now earlier this year I've had up to 30 right off my house, and they're all sitting there with big purple sea urchins, and I'm expecting the kelp bed here to regenerate significantly because they've reduced these kelp eating sea urchins. So my point is, no part of this world is going to survive without our love, and we can't just love it. We have to, of course, be effective. And listening to you guys, I see that you are grappling with these issues, and you are trying to protect these animals that you've grown to love. But the other message is also one of don't give up, because somehow the ocean and its residents are so resilient that they are still here, many of them, despite what we have done to them. And that makes me think that if we could just figure out how to live with them, we could figure out what really they can't stand about us, what they can't tolerate, what they can't survive. If we can change that behavior in ourselves, that we have such an enormous opportunity for them to make a comeback and become, we become good neighbors. We become a better animal. We basically grow up and stop behaving like 3-year-olds and just breaking stuff because we can. There's this remarkable science that I try to advocate for as much as I can. It's in the government. It's being pioneered by a woman scientist, Dr. Christy Miller, who is an incredibly tough woman who has put up with, muzzling and denials and humiliation. And what her science can do is it actually reads the immune system of fish, which is like the honest truth. It's a cellular based language that actually all of us share. When a salmon gets hit with an influenza type virus, their immune system turns on switches in the same pattern as ours does, which is just incredible to me. So it's the immune system upregulating certain proteins, so basically picking up specific tools. And if you are good at interpreting what these different proteins are used for, you can start to assess what the fish is dealing with, what is stressing it. And if you take this science and you apply it, you start sampling the fish, way up in the rivers, and then as they go by the farms and then our cities, and then they go into the ocean, and then they go by salmon farms and everything else. By reading the patterns of these immune systems, you can see exactly where the fish are running into trouble. And then you can go to that area and say, okay, how do you think we can fix this? And so this becomes then a municipal and an indigenous First Nation governance problem. It's a local problem of how to change human behavior to fix whatever problem you see in the salmon. And the really cool thing about this science is the next year when the salmon go through that area, you can read their immune system again and figure out, did you fix it or not? You can ask the fish, did we make it better for you or not? Well, this could be going on with gray whales, with birds. We should all be genomically profiled. I mean, the first cancer cells that happen in our bodies that we react to, our immune system would light up and we could, direct attention to it. Big pharma is not going to like this, but it's an incredibly powerful tool. You could figure out, are those gray whales starving, or are they full of toxins, or is it some other stress? Uh, it is so significantly powerful. It's called genomic profiling. So it's just something I would really encourage people to try to find out more about. Um, I'm hoping that we can start using that here, to figure out why salmon runs are mysteriously disappearing, or salmon runs are really coming back. Like we had a tremendous Chinook salmon run last year, and the DNA says they're from the Elwha River in Washington State, which is so interesting because salmon really link us together. There's salmon being caught among the salmon farms here that are from Oregon as well. So those of us who, work with these different species, we are connecting together and sort of with or without government, trying to understand what is going on with them and how to fix it. So I guess before we open up to questions, I hope there's some. I just want to say that, even though Canada is a beautiful democracy and a fabulous country, that activism really is necessary sometimes. And there's protesting, and then there's simply standing in the way. And I'm a huge advocate of simply standing in the way in a peaceful manner with a coherent message, in alliance with the Indigenous governments, which I work for now. I work for the local Namgis First Nation, because these are governments that have a lot of issues. Obviously, every sort of human grouping has issues, but they want wild salmon. They want their relatives, the orcas, to survive. And these governments actually have a mechanism within them to deal with this. These governments were formed at a time when destroying the salmon runs meant death to the community, when it was that close. It still means that, but we don't feel it because we got supermarkets and we have stuff coming from all over the place. And the non-Indigenous governments are struggling to deal with things that we don't pay for, like oxygen, like clean air, like clean water, like keeping biodiversity. And I've realized over the years that and I'm talking salmon here, but this is true of whales or any living creature. For salmon, the rainfall is important, the rivers are important, the ocean is important. And so am I and my colleagues. I have become part of the biology of wild salmon on this coast. And I hear you talking, and you have become part of the biology of the gray whales that are swimming past your coast. You have become important to them. And so, in moments of frustration and wanting to give up and just feeling like, maybe you're not getting anywhere, as I hear you say you're seeing less whales than you had before, just know that they really need you, and you are as important to them as those shrimp that they're pulling out of the mud. it might sound over grandiose in some ways, but I think it's very important that we realize that we are part of their biology, and they need us that much. So don't give up and keep talking. And I'm kind of curious with those orca that you guys have seen, are you identifying them? Like, are you sure that they are the mammal eaters, or maybe you're seeing our resident whales spilling down that way, or the mysterious offshore orca, which are covered in like major wounds on their fins. And so the belief is that they're probably eating a lot of sharks. We haven't seen them for a while, but anyway, I was just kind of curious about that. So I'm going to give you guys a little space here and see if any of you have any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. If you would like to unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can put questions in the chat box, and then we can.
Yeah, I've seen that Josh McGinnis has looked at a lot of the orca sightings that we've had on the Oregon coast this year, and he has been identifying a lot of them as transients, various groups of transients from the different groups that there are out there. So he's seeing various ones, but they seem to be all transients. I'm not aware of any gray whale calves that have been taken. Maybe there has been one along our coast. I know Monterey Bay's had quite a few here in recent times. And they've been coming up, I think, looking for some of our harbor seals. Our harbor seals here just are finishing up their pupping season. So that's another food source for them. So he's identified what I've seen so far that most of the sightings we've had have been the transients of some sort.
Okay, thanks, Ira.
Okay, let's see here. I have from Cheryl Conway, fabulous presentation, and from Kristen, thank you for spending time with us this morning.
You're so welcome.
All right. And I would like to just mention that Alexandra's new book is out called Not on My Watch. So it's available now if people are interested in reading and learning more about this. And let's see, someone says, thank you for your dedication and inspiration. I could listen to you for hours. Very interesting and captivating.
Well, thanks.
I would say that you are very inspiring, and really this is encouraging to help us keep going with our work. Here's a question. Are any fish farms worth keeping open?
Well, there is a push to move them onto land. And I think if you're going to do that, you have to, you really should start at the bottom of the food chain and start farming algae, and then take the algae and feed it to a fish that eats algae, and then take the waste from that fish and grow a crop. You need to create sort of your own ecosystem and isolate it away from the wild, because the problem with aquaculture is it just breaks all the natural laws. The fish are crowded, they can't migrate, and the predators, who are nature's cleanup crew, are not allowed in. And so viruses, bacteria, and parasites just explode and then pour out. And to answer your question, the problem, at least with the industry here, and I know I've worked with people who are fighting the industry in Puget Sound, it's an economy of scale. So they are not happy with one farm, 2 farms, 19 farms. They always need more farms, because they are based on share price, and share price goes up when there's growth. So the answer is no. Let's just get them out of the ocean, put them on land. There's a lot of people doing it. A lot of countries are doing it. For some reason, it's not happening on the West Coast here, but that's the answer. And let's just turn on the wild system, because that is really what makes fish and food and oxygen and all the rest of it. So yeah, there really is no place for salmon farms in the ocean.
There was a question, what are the next steps to remove the net pens and how can we support the Canada First Nations from the US?
Well, so you have the Wild Fish Conservancy in Washington State who are on the front lines of the fight. And we've been down there together and we've published research together. So incredibly, Washington State went first and banned Atlantic salmon farms, but now they have permission to put steelhead in these farms, which is no better because it's still going to amplify the pathogens and the parasites. So I would, for supporting getting the farms out in Washington State, I would contact the Wild Fish Conservancy and see where they're at with it. As for supporting Canada, it would be really great if you guys would write to our minister. So we have a kick-ass fisheries minister, Bernadette Jordan from the East Coast, Nova Scotia, who has just like struck out on her own. And on December 17th, she told the 3 Norwegians, we just have 3 Norwegian companies farming here, they could not restock 19 salmon farms in the Narrows off of Vancouver Island, where 1/3 of all our wild salmon and a lot of yours go through. And the industry is embroiled in lawsuits and they're suing her and all the rest of it. But she seems determined. And so if you could write to the Canadian Minister of Fisheries, Bernadette Jordan, just Google her address, it's very easy, and thank her for allowing the salmon to get to sea without being covered with sea lice. The difficulty is she's facing as her department has produced science that is an outlier. The rest of us who are not funded by government or industry, where it's very clear sea lice from salmon farms are killing off wild salmon. But scientists in DFO are coming up with the opposite results. And there's this huge effort to really soften the blow for the industry, to protect them, to not allow the science showing the impact of the bacteria and viruses from actually getting to the minister. So the minister is in a difficult situation, and I'm just doing everything I can to support her. It's the first time for me in this 30-year battle that the minister and I are in agreement, and some support from the United States would be amazing. And the other thing is, in my book, Not on My Watch, which I decided to write because the occupation of the farms was just such an extraordinary event, full of turmoil, but also incredibly successful. And let me tell you, after years, decades of fighting this industry, when I decided to occupy a farm myself, that moment of stepping from the boat onto the farm was so empowering. I just just went from victim to, fighting back in a new and really satisfying way, surrounded by RCMP with, bulletproof vests and pistols. And in the end, they didn't touch me. They all left, and they left me on the farm with the farmers in the middle of night inlet and October storm. And it was fabulous. So that book needs to get out, because I also document the corruption in the science, the fabulous nature of these fish and the whales that I was studying. But the more the book gets out, it is a form of activism itself. The more the Canadian government is going to have to go, okay, you know what? This whole ruse is up. We're going to have to just deal with this thing. So yeah, asking your bookstores to stock it, or your libraries, or anything you can think of, or contact me if you know of like a really good book reviewer that maybe I should send it to. That would be a huge help. I'm on Facebook, Alexandra Morton. I have 2 different pages, but you can contact me on any one of them if you want to do that. I also have a website, alexandramorton.ca, and there's a contact thing there too. So that would be incredibly helpful. If any of you know how to get a hold of Oprah, definitely write to me. just throwing it out there.
Looks like Cheryl has a question.
Yes. Have you been following the uh, the efforts to remove the 4 dams on the Snake River to improve salmon down here at the Oregon, Washington, Idaho borders?
I have not been following it in detail, but it's so incredible to me that this is even possible. So is that going well? Is it happening?
A lot of push from the electric industries. I'm quite sure in Lewiston that the transportation of the grain down to the Portland port is also giving an anti-push. There's a lot of barriers, but it's a beginning. I mean, yeah, our Oregon's governor is for removal.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing there's any salmon left with all the abuse we've given them, but they are still here. And one of the really weird things, you might be aware we have pink salmon. They're the littlest salmon on this coast. And with the reduction in ice in the Arctic, pink salmon are making their way to Norway and starting to colonize Norwegian rivers, which the Norwegians are pretty disturbed about. And so I keep thinking, well, if these little guys can go all the way over there and colonize an entirely new ecosystem, they can probably make a comeback here. And the really great thing about pink salmon is they are so little, they're tiny when they go to sea, so which makes them incredibly vulnerable to the farms. But everything eats them. The coho eat them, the chinook eat them, the steelhead eat them. And so they bolster the other salmon species. They also return in such huge numbers that they clean the rivers with all their presence and their digging, and the bears eat them and the eagles eat them, and the bigger other salmon can hide amongst them and get in there. So they're like a gift to the ecosystems. They also, one of the amazing things about salmon is they go out and they collect the energy of the sun in the open ocean by eating zooplankton and small fish. And then they carry that energy back, and then they climb the mountains. And then when they die, they pour that energy down over these trees and these forests. And so they feed the trees that make the oxygen we breathe. Restoring salmon is fighting climate change. And pink salmon are such a gift, along with chum, or dogs, they get called here sometimes, because their kids don't live in the river. So the parents go in, they lay the eggs, the little guys hatch, they go straight out to sea and try to make their fortune in the ocean. And all the nutrients of the parents feed the ecosystems. That marine nitrogen is different than terrestrial nitrogen. So scientists are tracking it way up into the alpine because, eagles pick it up and carry the carcasses around. So they are an incredibly, I feel like on the coast of BC, if we're going to let wild salmon go down, you might as well just like pull the power cord out of the side of your house. It's that much energy that is coming into this coast with these fish. So they're incredibly important.
Well, thank you very much for all your years of effort and diversity that you changed directions and what you aspire to achieve for the world. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I've tried to quit, honestly, but like, where are you going to go? You have to stand ground.
Another comment, I too want to thank you. You hit so many emotional buttons. Incredible presentation, informative and inspiring, as others have said. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
I have a comment, but it's more for the ACS rather than a discussion on the food resource for our beloved whales. It interplays, it intertwines. The forage fish are extremely important. So, yeah.
They are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. Couple other questions. Fish hatcheries. Do you have any thoughts or comments on fish hatcheries versus the fish farms?
Yeah, I do. It's a tough one because people running fish hatcheries, and I was one of them, are wonderful, fabulous people that care deeply. But honestly, salmon don't need help mating and breeding. They got that. They need help with everything else. They need help getting to sea. And when you think about salmon, so you've probably seen, when they go into the rivers, some of them grow stripes, some of them grow huge humps, some of them grow teeth, some of them turn bright red. Why do they do that? It's the males, right, that are doing this. And so you think about this fish, he's come in from the open ocean, he's entering a shallow, warm, fresh, really weird and chaotic environment. He's going to swim up river, like in some cases 1,000 kilometers. He's growing his testes, and he can't eat. And yet he takes a whole bunch of his energy and he puts it into dressing up. And so why is he doing this? Well, he's advertising to the females. He's saying, hey, baby, I went out to the Pacific Gyre and I came back and I got all of this extra. I am so good at surviving that I can put this huge hump on my back for no reason whatsoever. And the female's going, yeah, no, you. And about 10 years ago, I went up the Fraser River and I was looking at Fraser River sockeye all the way up the river. And oh my gosh, so in the Adams River, they're a huge, deep-bodied fish. When you get to the Chilco River, way up, they're a streamlined little bullet. And when you get all the way to the top at Takla Landing, they're tiny. They're not a big, fat fish. So that's female choice. And when we have hatcheries, we take that away from them. We take away their ability to track the changes in their rivers. I don't know how the females are making this choice, but they are. And so as climate change happens and fish are going to be dealing with all these variables, we really got to leave it up to them. And so in my view, we shouldn't have hatcheries, but we should do everything we can to protect every single mated pair and every little nest that is built in the rivers. And that the energy should be focused on that, because as soon as people make that choice as to who breeds with who, well, you might as well cut their tails off. You've taken away their most powerful tool for survival. A single generation of a hatchery changes over 700 genes within the fish. It's catastrophic, and it has never worked. So, but it is a tough message to tell people, because I worked in a hatchery. We used to relay race the fish down from these pools. We stick them in a tube, and literally we all stood along the trail and we ran as hard as we could to get this fish into the hatchery and before it died. And when coho finally made a comeback in the Broughton Archipelago, they came back to every river except the one that I was working on, because the guy who was picking the fish was picking the biggest, most beautiful fish. We were a tiny little stream. It wasn't meant for big fish. So it was a lesson that really got drilled in. And then, of course, I've read the science since then, and they just don't work.
I have another comment, if I may. Cheryl, I have another comment.
Sure.
So having been involved in the electric industry in the Pacific Northwest for many years, I find that the discussion from the electric side that, record number of salmon, they came past Bonneville Dam. Right. Give me the numbers. How many of those were hatchery fish versus wild? They don't give me the numbers. They don't tell the people responsible for producing, for running the electric companies. So they're omitting key factors to try to push their point about dams and how this and the recovery of salmon. I get extremely upset. I walk out on one woman every single time for years. I will not listen. I've listened one time. Her story never changes. She never gives us the numbers.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I've sat in meetings over the years and thought, is this the moment when I jump up on the table and just start yelling? I haven't
Mhm.
done that, but you know, you're constantly trying to figure out how do you communicate these things, and it's very hard to do. So I definitely sympathize with the frustration of that.
Thank you.
So I have a question. As the fish farms are being removed, have you seen any of the whales start to return?
I have. So I didn't get to see it, but earlier this year, I think it was in February, there's a wonderful man that lives on the next island, Jared Towers, and he actually works for Fisheries and Oceans Canada as their whale survey guy. And he was out with the A4 pod, which is very close to the A5 pod. And he watched them go into Fife Sound in the Broughton Archipelago. And he texted me. And well, I started crying. You know, this was decades later. And I was really worried. Like when I first started studying orca, I would go out in front of the males and drop my hydrophone, because what I was always trying to do was figure out which way the whales were going, get out ahead of them, stop the boat, drop the hydrophones, and then have as long as time as possible that I could hear and see them. So I wanted them to come right at me and pass me. Well, nobody was following the males. I figured this out very quickly. They were following these older females. And since the whales stopped coming into the Broughton Archipelago, a lot of these older females have died naturally, I suppose, I hope. And so I began to worry that maybe the pathways that they took, like for example, the orca like to come into the Broughton Archipelago at the beginning of an ebb tide. They're like wolves hunting. They want to be downwind. They want to be able to taste their way along. And they want to come in through Fife Sound, which is the main fish highway. And so I learned to encounter them. I would go out to the end of Fife Sound at the beginning of the ebb, and that was my, you know, that was my method of trying to intercept them. And so I began to worry as these females died that maybe that knowledge might no longer be in an orca mind. It might be stuck in my mind. I might be the only one that knows this. And so when they came into Fife Sound at the beginning of an ebb tide, I was like, okay, phew, that is one worry I can just like cross off the list. They still had that knowledge. Some of the youngsters had picked it up and retained it, and we're doing it. And so I just hope that they had a good trip, and you know, that they got a few fish, and that they will come back. But yeah, I actually called my son, who was a baby in the boat with me all those years, and a child growing up, and he was like the only one that would know how significant that was. And so yeah, it was a big moment for me. It felt really great. You're on mute, Joy.
Wonderful. Um, Anyone else have any questions? Okay.
Well,
Well,
I would like to make one more comment. I realize that this is the beginning of a long fight, and by beginning, you've been at it since the 80s. It seems much longer to you, um, but keep it up. Yes,
Will do. I
and
seem
spread
unable,
the word.
I seem unable to stop. And but I do want to just say to everybody who is in a fight, do take care of yourself, because this is not a short-term thing. And there's lots of really fabulous young activists who pull all-nighters and do extraordinary things, but I tell them the same thing. Make sure you don't burn out, because I see it all the time. And it almost happened to me, and I write about it in my book. And I had a, you know, I was able to, the last year that I spent on the ship with the Sea Shepherd crew, saved me because I was so down and I have never felt depression, but I managed to get there. And they healed me up just by being so kind. And I was lucky to have that experience. But I'm just saying, be careful, take care of yourself, make sure you rest. And I'm so lucky I live in the wilderness. But if you don't, get there and soak it up. So because you're important, you're really, really important. All right. Good luck to you guys. Good luck with your whales.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra.
You're so welcome.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
So much.
That was an incredibly special time. Thank you so much, Alexandra, and thanks to the Oregon Cetacean Society for putting this on.
Thanks.
I'm a Canadian, by the way.
Okay. See me on, contact me on Facebook if you want.
Will do.
Okay, so finishing up with just a few announcements. So our speaker series will resume in September. And then we have our Summer Whale Watch weekend that's going to happen on July 31st and August 1st. And more details will come as we get closer to the time about how that's going to work and what that's going to look like. It will be a little bit different. And then keep in mind that the comment period will come up and on the whale entanglement conservation plan. And once I get that, I will send it out so that people can review it and provide some comments on it. So thank you all for being here today. And
One other thing. I got
yes.
one other thing. Fluke Prints, August 1st, need articles. So please submit your articles and hopefully somebody may be talented enough to write up what we just learned today.
Possible. So I had a question that was really for the ACS group. Has anyone read the article about Norway is going to use experiment with audio on the whales? I almost flipped.
I was going to say I read a little bit of something, but I don't know much about the topic.
Yeah, it would
No, I
seem
don't
even
either.
in today's presentation when she talked about the orcas and the noise that the fish farms were emitting to keep them away from the farms. I mean, it flabbergasts me that a country like Norway that still hunts whales would even have to do that. There is evidence out there. So yeah, so that was my one comment.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So hopefully I will see some of you in the end of July, and we will then meet again starting in the fall. Thank you all.
Thanks, Joy.